This is an older work, so I'm not going to put in quite as much time polishing it up. Also, it was not originally broken into chapters, so if some of the chapter breaks seem a little bit weird, that's why. Broken Guardian by Elaine Allen. Chapter 1. The stars were sent down by God to bless, protect, and teach the peaceful Ellyrians. Born from the light and warmth of prayers and love, they took human shape and became leaders, artists, priests. Everything they took their hands to was good. From across the mountain there came warriors, who found ways to use the blood, flesh, and very lives of the stars as a source of power. The peaceful Ellyrians were horrified that anyone would harm their stars. To protect them, they built walls and castles. But in response to the people's basic defenses came first raiders, then armies. Some Ellyrians fought for their stars, but they were new to the arts of war, and the generations of the stars mixing blood with the Ellyrians left the people beautiful and creative, but not attuned to violence and battle. The stars could not accept the bloodshed. They begged the people to abandon all militant works, and when their defenses were at their weakest, the people agreed. It was decided that whatever lands the enemy armies had taken would remain theirs, and the stars would build one final wall. Tied to the very bones of the land, this wall would not be one of stone and mortar, but of hope and faith, the stars' lives and power. What they created was a barrier that would become part of the very land around them. Trees grew along the border, mountains rose, rivers flowed, and chasms opened. As long as the stars survived, no one would invade the lands of their peaceful people. The people were happy and the stars were safe. But nothing lasts forever. The first that Dahiel knew of the war was when he went in search of his tutor. He stumbled into the yard, rubbing eyes that had grown bleary from too many hours reading. There was blood on the cobblestones, and Dahiel's tutor was lying face down under the rose bushes. There were men everywhere. To 10-year-old Dahiel, they seemed angry giants. Armored men chased priests and children, but one man still fought hard, backed into a corner with a girl crouched behind him. Dahiel had not even known there was a star in the monastery, but the small girl was unquestionably just that. She was blonde, with perfect curls and the palest blue eyes that sparkled with gold highlights. Her guardian swung his scythe at the men facing him, but one dodged under the blade, and his sword drew a line of red down the guardian's chest. The guardian wore no armor. He hadn't had time to dress for battle. He fell, still trying to shield the girl. The man's eyes caught Dahiel as he fell, and young as he was, Dahiel recognized the moment the guardian died. The star began to cry, gently tugging the man's sleeve as if to wake him. Dahiel couldn't leave her there, alone. As soon as he stepped out of the shadowy doorway, Dahiel panicked, but he moved forward anyway. He dodged through the armed invaders and managed to get his arms around the star, but there was nowhere to go. The men had closed in, leaving no gaps to slip through. Dahiel turned away, desperate for a safe place to run. A tingle went through him, like the shock off metal objects in stormy weather, but not so unpleasant. He barely noticed, curled in against the expected pain of a blade biting into his back, but when he finally opened his eyes, it was to an empty expanse unlike anything he had ever seen. Everywhere Dahiel had ever been was green and growing, but here was nothing but sand and sky. It took weeks for Dahiel to figure out that they were in another world entirely. They floated through the world they had fallen into, unwilling to stay still and unable to find a new home. Begging with Maren in tow was incredibly effective. All they had to do was stand there and people would coo over the little girl like she was a lovable puppy. When they left, the two children would have enough to eat or the money for lodgings. But it was inevitable that living as they did, eventually they would run into someone who did not just want to coo at the little girl. They had been lucky in their first jump to have landed somewhere that neither of them looked all that different from the locals, and where orphans were common but highly pitied. It would be different later on. Within a year, they would find themselves stepping into lands where they could not be mistaken for anything but strangers, lands where a children wandering alone was not a sight to be pitied, but a target to be used and abused. Dahiel would have had no clue how to handle it if they had been so treated on their first trip. He protected and cared for the star without thought or question. Her name was Maren, and she was barely 6 years old. Dahiel perfected the art of running. while dragging the little girl behind him. Maren rarely even noticed that they were in trouble until Dahiel grabbed her hand and took off. When things got too bad, the portal magic would kick in, and the children would find themselves once more in a whole new world. Soon enough, Maren began to grow up. She changed swiftly from the delightfully sweet doll into a delicate young woman. By the time she was 13, she already had strange men following her and fighting for her interest. Maren was an unassuming girl and was only upset by the attention. But her beauty was not even the biggest of Dahiel's worries. Maren glowed, especially at night, and if Dahiel did not watch her carefully, she tended to tell complete strangers things about themselves that she should have had no way of knowing. People flocked to her, and most loved her, but any time they fell into a world where magic was common, or even present at all, it was only a matter of time before someone would look at Maren like she was a feast just waiting to be eaten. Dahiel had to rely more and more on the guardian's scythe to fend off the unwanted attention. The weapon was a strange bit of metal and wood. It had been sitting in the sand next to him in that first world they had fallen into, and no matter how many times he left it behind, it followed him. A guardian's weapon could cut through magic and enchantment as well as flesh and bone. It could not be bespelled, and it could not break. It could not be taken from the guardian except in death, and it came to him when he needed it. It was the physical manifestation of the guardianship that had passed to Dahiel unintentionally when he stepped in to save the star, and it helped him become a formidable foe, whether he wanted to or not. Dahiel thought he was insane when he saw the Lori warrior in the marketplace in a small island nation known as Scoresland. He was alone, having left the star with a matronly innkeeper while he went out to find some money. Begging had become significantly less lucrative since he had decided it was too dangerous to take Maren, which meant he had been out there for hours. Dahiel pushed himself off the wall he was leaning against and stepped out to follow the armored man. But the market was crowded, and by the time Dahiel made his way to the spot he thought he had seen the Lori, the man had disappeared. Dahiel hadn't seen anyone from his home world since the day he and Maren had left, and as far as he knew, no one else could jump between worlds. Standing in a bright, over-full market, worlds away from his home, Dahiel knew that he was seeing things, and knew just as certainly that he needed to get back to Maren. It was time to leave. Dahiel arrived just in time to fight his way through a dozen men. The pleasant innkeeper was gone, dead or prisoner to a band of men that had Maren bound in a corner of the stable. Even from across the yard, Dahiel could see the panic on the star's face. She was crying and her lip was split. He tore through the armored men as if they were paper dolls. He cut Maren free, grabbed her hand, the portal opened, and they found themselves somewhere new. None of the men had been Loris, but it strained credulity that Maren would find her life in danger the same day that Dahiel spotted one of the star's oldest enemies. Less than a month later, Dahiel saw the Lori just beyond the gates of the farm where he was working as a day laborer. This time he did not bother chasing the man. As soon as Dahiel caught the flash of dark armor out of the corner of his eye, he abandoned his work and waved Maren over. She dropped the basket she had been collecting berries in and met him halfway. As their hands met and the portal opened around them, Dahiel saw billowing smoke over the farmhouse. Twice had to be more than coincidence. Maybe he was just being paranoid, but he could not risk the chance that the Loris were actually following them. He started making plans. They needed to find a way to draw less attention to themselves. Everywhere they went, they were strangers. It was not unusual for them to find themselves in a world where no one had ever seen blonde hair, blue eyes, or even pale skin. Dahiel almost always stood out less than his star. Dahiel was decidedly average. Average height, average build, his hair as bland a brown as were his eyes. There were very few worlds where his appearance was rare, whereas through all the worlds they had traveled, he had never met another person with golden blue eyes like the stars. There was not much they could do about her appearance. Dyes did not stick to Maren's hair or skin, and even if they had, Dahiel never knew when a portal would take them to a world where whatever changes they had made would make her stand out even more. Through trial and error, Dahiel taught himself enough guardian magic to hide what Maren was. At first he could just deaden her glow when they were touching, and many people in the places they passed through would remember them as siblings so close they might as well be physically joined. With practice, Dahiel learned to hold the illusion for days at a time, even when Maren was not in his sights, and their lives became much simpler. He learned to hide the golden shine of her eyes, though nothing he could do changed their pale blue color, nor ever completely rid them of golden highlights. In the 7 years they had been traveling together, Dahiel never learned much of anything about the portals. They came when they were needed and disappeared before he had a chance to think about them. In his childhood, he had spent years learning theology and history, mediation and etiquette, art and mathematics, but he knew nothing of magic. Dahiel doubted that he was responsible for the portals at all. He never opened one on purpose, and when he tried to, nothing happened. He had no control over where they went, though they never ended up in the same place twice. He honestly assumed they were a way of the world rearranging itself to protect the star. They were in an underground prison when Dahiel learned something new about the portals. Sitting in the damp darkness, Dahiel had been thinking rather bleak thoughts when he felt the electric tingle that meant a portal was opening. He panicked. Maren was in the next cell over, with a wall of solid stone between them. If a portal took Dahiel to another world, the star would be left behind. But the portal did not open in the exact spot where Dahiel was, as it always had before. It opened in front of him. He had never seen a portal before, but there was no question that that was what this was. A shimmering patch of sunlit field hovered in the air. "Maren," he called out to her, hoping that no guard was near enough to overhear. "Yes, Dahiel?" She didn't sound scared. She never did. She trusted him too much. "A portal has opened." If the walls had been of bar alone, Dahiel's scythe could have easily cut through, but in the time it would take him to chop his way through the stone, the guards would come, and enough of them could easily stop him from getting to Maren. Maren was silent for a few moments. Dahiel wasn't sure if she was thinking, or if her sight had warned her that a guard was near, and so he waited silently for her to reply. He had never held open a portal before, and doing so banished any question he had about whether he opened them. It was painfully hard to keep it from closing. Like holding a weight above his head, it got heavier with each breath he took. He was already feeling weak, but he couldn't let it go. He had no way of knowing if he would be able to get it back, and the guards would be back any moment. He was sweating by the time his star finally responded. "Dahiel, I want you to go through the portal, without me. I'm sure I'll be fine. You have a chance to escape, and you should take it." He ignored her. There had to be something he could do to get Maren through. He thought he was doing all he could to hold the portal open, but as he heard the unmistakable sound of jailers returning, desperation overwhelmed him. He reached out and pushed. The portal slid will-o-wisp light through the walls. His half-realized intention was just to get it into Maren's cell, but as it slid over the stone, an idea occurred to him. He didn't have time to fully think it through, which was probably for the better. As soon as the portal touched the wall between the star and the guardian's cell, Dahiel reached through it. He found Maren's hand on instinct, pulled her towards him, and jumped into the portal.